this Luke passage, Jesus, in my opinion, is remarkable in this story. And if you've ever been in leadership before a community of people, I want you to put yourself in Jesus' position. There's this man out in the crowd as Jesus is teaching, and he says, "Teacher, teacher, would you please talk to my brother?" Now, if you've ever been in leadership as a teacher, as someone who was trying to lead a community of people, and somebody says, "Pastor Jen, I want you to talk to my child. Pastor Jen, I want you to tell my husband that. Pastor Jen, I want you to talk to my mother and tell," what is the first response? This is a problem. You're inviting me right into the middle of a conflict and suggesting that somehow you want to use my authority to push somebody you love up against the wall. Raise your hand if you've ever seen that happen. Right? But Jesus is no joke. Jesus does not enter into the setup that this man, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the family inheritance." But he said to him, "Friend, who set me to be a judge or an arbiter over you?" And he said to them, "Take care, be on guard against all kinds of greed." And Jesus launches into this parable that ends up convicting the man who wanted him to use his authority to judge another to the core. I want you to think about families that have been at that awful stage in grief, particularly when matriarch or patriarch of a family has passed on, and all of a sudden you're left with some amount of legacy. The family home and inheritance to divide property that belonged to someone. And in that moment of tender grief, that moment of need, instead of people rallying around each other, all sorts of dissension starts to grow. Raise your hand if you've ever seen this happen. It doesn't have to be your family. I can't tell you how common this is. That this dissension would begin and family member rises up against family member and the will gets reread 100 times, and who was first and who was second and why do you get that and why don't I get this, and did everything get accounted for, and did everybody get the piece of furniture or the jewelry or the piece of property that they wanted? And what was once a family unit disintegrates in the very passing of the matriarch or patriarch and their legacy. One of the moments when I felt a really deep sense of gratitude for my husband was when he had traveled to Camden, New Jersey with his mother after the death of someone in his family, and things got ugly. People started talking about where money might be stashed and who was first and which person, and my husband said to me, "Jen," I just stood there and I said, "Look, I have a wife, I have 2 children, and I have a life that I value, and none of this is worth it." And he took his mother's hand and they came home. They didn't stay to fight over the money and the inheritance and the resources, because there was an abiding sense of the life that mattered before them. Greed has this really ugly, insidious way of blinding us to the very things we have before us. A way of taking over our decisions and our actions and turning us into people we never were or don't even understand ourselves to be. Andy Stanley says that of all the enemies of the heart that we are talking about, this one is the most silent and subtle and insidious of all. And I invite you to think about that. When we're wrestling with guilt, it has this way of cramping up in our stomach, this way of calling us to a sense of response. Anger has this way of welling up from the tip of our toes. You can feel it rising. If your skin's light enough in color, I swear I can see it in my child. It comes from here and it just grows and grows and grows. It's hard not to know you're fighting that feeling. But greed is not something that many of us would say that we struggle with in our life. But I want you to stay connected because I believe that there are actual manifestations of greed that are present in many of our interactions. And we are unaware of how powerful they are over us. Andy Stanley suggests that greed is fueled fear. It is fear that exists in our life, and for some reason, it is fueled, it is fed, it is augmented. And we live with this sense that there is not enough. Fear is this way of leading us down the path of asking 1,000 what ifs. Give me a what if question in the face of fear. What's a what if question? What if my house burns down? What if I lose my job? Give me another one. What if I risk my heart in love and get hurt? What if I give away something very precious to me and nobody receives it? What if I spend all my time in something that I think is of value and it doesn't produce the fruit I want? What if I invest in another person and they don't return the investment? What if my child turns out different than I want? What if my youth sees enough of me that they call me to accountability? And in the face of those what if questions and that fear, we tend to control and control and control because we buy the lie that we can protect ourselves. That if we work hard enough, save enough, are judicious enough in how we interact with others, that somehow we can build around ourselves a level of protection that doesn't require us to need anyone. Raise your hand if you have ever been hurt and you said to somebody else or to yourself, I will never let somebody in that deep again. I will never need a man in my life. I will never be financially dependent on anyone else. I will never trust a pastor again. I will never invest in a church community. Raise your hand if you've ever done an I will never. You don't have to have told anyone. I'm not going to ask you what you said it about, right? We're all filled with I will nevers. In our hurt and our indignation, we say, nope, I'm going to protect myself from whatever is hurting us. But the power of this parable that Jesus tells, he goes from this story about a brother who wants Jesus to use his authority to accuse another brother for wanting too much of the inheritance. And Jesus talks about this rich man who has crops that keep producing. And they keep producing so much that he builds a barn. And then what happens? Y'all are asleep. What happens? He builds a barn, and then what? He has more. So then what does he want? He needs to build a bigger barn. You know, like all of those storage spaces, right? So you have a big house, but then you need to buy a storage space to fit the things that don't fit in your house. Or you have a house, but you need to buy a house with a basement to fill it with all of the things that don't fit on your first and second floor. So the guy's like, look, I just keep producing grain and grain, so I'm going to build a bigger barn. Andy Stanley calls it BBS syndrome, bigger barn syndrome, right? He just keeps building and building. And the scripture is so poignant. The man says, I will say to my soul, soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, be merry. But God said to him, what? What does God say? I'm in verse 20. God says, you fool. You fool. This very night, your life is being demanded. And the things you've prepared, whose will they be now? So it is with those who store up treasures for themselves, but are not rich towards God. Jesus takes this sense of protection and control and stuff and financial security and says, you've got this confused. You think that life is stuff and that stuff is life, but the reality is at the very end of the day, when your name and my name are called, we go without any of the stuff in the moment that God asks. And Jesus' point is, you don't have control. You don't have control over everything in your life. I do. I want you to go back to your scripture. Verse 22, we're going to keep reading. So I'm on page 74 of the Pew Bible. We missed this. After Jesus tells this parable in verse 22, he says to his disciples, therefore I tell you, what does he say? Verse 22. Do not worry. Turn to somebody. Do not worry. I can't even look Michael in the eye. Do not worry, right? This scripture is written for me. Do not worry about your life, about what you will eat, or about your body, or what you will wear. For life is more than food, and the body is more than clothing. Consider the ravens. They neither sow nor reap. They have neither storehouse nor barn. And yet what happens? God feeds them. Of how much more value are you than the birds? And can any of you, I love this, can any of you by worrying add a single hour to your life? Raise your hand if you ever worried. I'm with you. Just raise your hand with me. Worried, right? Have you added an hour to your life? How about a few minutes? Jesus is saying, pay attention who holds your life in his hand. Pay attention that I can call you when you have the biggest barn built. Pay attention that the birds of the air and the lilies of the field are provided for. And this deep-seated fear that you will not have enough goes against the promises I've made you. I want you to hear me when I say greed is not a financial issue. You can have lots and lots of financial resources. You can have an abundance of possessions and not have a spirit of greed. There are people who live with great wealth and consistently give it away. And you can have paycheck to paycheck and live with a deep sense of greed that you can't possibly trust or share. Greed is not a financial issue. It is a heart issue. And at the very core, it is about trust in God's provision for our lives. As I delved deeper into this, I was struck by Andy Stanley's push that truly greed is something that most of us dismiss in our life. Who will be honest with me? When you looked at these four enemies of the heart, guilt, anger, greed, and jealousy, was greed one of those that you were like, yeah, that one's less relevant to me? Raise your hand if you did that. I'm right with you. I was like, nah, that's not the one that's going to touch me. So it was actually Denise who was having this dialogue with me talking about greed, and she said, I really think we need to look at selfishness and possessiveness. And I started looking at definitions. Greed is to be consumed by selfish desires, an intense selfish desire for wealth. And selfishness is the quality of lacking consideration for others, concerned chiefly with our own personal profit or pleasure. All right, God, you're getting closer. Possessiveness, an unwillingness to yield possession of, a desire to possess, to maintain control over, or to dominate, a sense that no one can do it as well as I can, therefore I owe it to myself to keep control. Is God talking to anybody yet? Does greed have something to do with your life? Andy Stanley suggests that greed actually hides under some very high-quality virtues. Greed can hide under the virtue of carefulness that says, well, we don't want to be too hasty in how we spend our resources. Or greed can hide under the virtue of saving, like the man who builds barns, Savings is a value. Certainly in this church, we talk about financial peace all the time. Greed can hide under the context of planning and assessing how many resources that we have. But if at the core of the decisions we make is a fear that God won't provide, that we don't have enough, and that we have to be in control in order to be safe, there is a deeper enemy of the heart at work. I'm going to go through 3 categories or ways this enemy shows up. And I want you to really be attentive to how this might be at work in your relationships. When that selfishness manifests itself in me and in you, we don't show our weak side. We don't expose any vulnerability. We lead with our ego first to protect. We have this sense that we're entitled, that we believe that whatever we want, whether it's our partner's attention, whether it's the next iPhone before us, whether it's the church's decision to do X, Y, or Z, we believe that what we want is owed to us by others and ourselves, and we just think it should be. We expect our relationships to meet our needs more than we pay attention to the needs of others. Raise your hand if you've ever done that in a relationship. What you giving me? How's this responding to what I need? We struggle to accept being wrong when we're selfish. We don't want to see our mistakes, and we don't want to ask for forgiveness. We always want to be in control. There's rarely room for any way other than the way we want it. We don't negotiate it. We just lay it out there and expect everyone else to come along. Raise your hand if you have ever interacted with someone manifesting selfish qualities. We're not talking about ourselves. Right? And what's at the heart of this? A desire to be in control of a relationship, of resources, of security. We look at possessiveness. When we manifest qualities of possessiveness, this desire to keep it all for ourselves, we tend to manipulate, even if subconsciously, by not disclosing all the information, by changing the plan when our partner's not involved, by sharing our feelings to control somebody, not to communicate. Has that ever happened to you? Has somebody ever dumped their feelings on you as a way to say, this conversation's over because I'm angry? Therefore, you have to submit. Has that ever happened to anyone? Am I talking to myself? Right? Greed is deeper than we acknowledge. We keep the power to decisions for ourselves so that ultimately things go like we want. We keep our grain in the barn so that we can make the choice. We tend to withhold. If I'm possessive and greedy and you don't respond like I want, what do? I stonewall you. I stop talking to you. I won't engage. I withhold intimacy. I'm not going to be a part of you because you're not willing to play by my rules. When we stop having control, we start keeping score. And all of a sudden, the abundance of love and mercy and grace shrivels. And everything feels bitter and fragile. The worst part about possessiveness is when we go to disrespecting the other. This happens in the church all the time. They didn't do it the way I want, therefore they are X, Y, and Z. Happens in relationships all the time. We undervalue the other person's feelings or thoughts. We become sarcastic, and we begin to erode their very character because they haven't given us what we want, and we want to be in control. When greed shows up in our life, we worry a lot about money. We're really poor when we lose because it's a zero-sum game. We're reluctant to share. We never believe that there's enough. We're never satisfied with what we have. In fact, what we do today is a platform to plan what we think we need tomorrow. So I may be standing here today, but only to decide that in the future, I want that kind of car. I want to buy that kind of house. I want to have that kind of education. And we squander the very life we have because we think we need something else. We lack gratitude for what we have, and we are rarely at peace. Raise your hand if one thing in there resonates in your life. One thing. Greed is at work, and usually under greed is fear and our desire to control. Jesus in verse 22, therefore I tell you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat, or about your body, what you will wear, for life is more than food, and the body more than clothing. Consider the ravens, they neither sow nor reap, they have neither storehouse nor barn, and yet God feeds them. And can any of you, by worrying, add a single hour to your lifespan? If then you are not able to do so small a thing as that, why do you worry about the rest? Consider the lilies, how they grow. They neither toil nor spin, yet I tell you, even Solomon in all his glory was not clothed like one of them. But if God so clothes the grass of the field, which is alive today and tomorrow thrown into the oven, how much more will he clothe you, you of little faith? The beginning steps to overcome greed in our life can start with faith. Because when you and I spend time in prayer and in scripture reading, when we declare faith, even when we're afraid, we push back the what ifs and we stand on the promises of God's goodness. We cultivate gratitude today. We begin to live in the now, grateful for what God has given us. The second thing that we can do to face this factor of greed, and if somebody around you is greedy or selfish or possessive, it's even more important. We can begin the financial practices of generosity. Andy Stanley has a way of simplifying everything. It's one of the things I love about him as a pastor. And he says that financial generosity is really divided into two categories. The first is percentage. He says, make a decision to give a percentage of the money that you earn to the ministries of the church and the poor. And start with a small percentage. But he says, make sure you give it up front. Because when you give it up front, you close the door on selfishness. You say from the very beginning, I am going to live on 2% less than what I make, because that 2% is not about my needs. It's about God's kingdom and the needs of others. And I'm going to close the door on selfishness from the very beginning. I had a woman in the church that I pastored previous who had nothing, raising children, desperate for resources to take care of them, and had risen to great wealth. And she said, you know what, Jen? The reality is, when I had so little and when I had so much, I came to the end of the month and had the same left over, because my needs just got greater when I had more money. Percentage giving puts the needs of others first and then invites you to respond to yours. The second thing Andy Stanley suggests, which I think is really powerful, and we haven't talked about this in regards to generosity. It's called spontaneous giving. Andy Stanley says, in addition to that percentage decision that you've made, walk around life with eyes of compassion. Some of you do this already, but walk around life intentionally attentive to people who are in need. And this has nothing to do with how much money you have. Somebody who's hurting, pay attention, give them of your time, and give them a card. Someone who literally is struggling to make ends meet, spontaneously respond, because what it does, in addition to putting the gate on your selfishness with the percentage gift, the spontaneous giving invites you and I to live attentive to somebody else's needs, not just our own. And I promise you, when you start doing that, you will see opportunity after opportunity after opportunity. And the more you follow God's lead, the more you will be blessed. The third and final thing I suggest to you is consider that you are not owners of your love, of your forgiveness, of your life, or of your money. You are not owners of your love, your forgiveness, your life, or your money. You love because God first loved you. You forgive because He first forgave you. You have because He has given you. And you breathe until the moment He calls you home. So if you are not the owner, but rather the manager, how do you manage all that God has put into your hands? You trust that maybe you have more money in your life right now because He's inviting you to give, not because He wants you to build a bigger barn. Do you have more time in your life because there's an investment that you're called to make? Do you have a capacity to love that is abundant? Not because you're a good person. It's because God has somebody that He's called you to love. Are you asked to forgive? Because in your forgiveness, somebody else will find freedom. Practice financial generosity, percentage and spontaneous giving. Cultivate faith. Speak it, declare it, live it, believe it. And understand yourself as a manager of resources that God provides. By worrying, have you added a single hour to your life? What if we trusted God to provide?